start with Peterson. Let's get that over with.
Yeah.
Because I wrote this article a long time ago, just kind of a critique of your article about Peterson. I also said in the article I thought it was probably the best critique of Peterson that I'd read, but I was also critiquing your critique. And then when I saw you in Kiev, I kind of wanted to apologize for it, but I didn't, and I still don't know whether I should apologize for it or not.
I don't think so. No, I think you slightly misread me, maybe.
I'm sure I did. It was just a blog post.
You know? Yeah, exactly. We take these things way too seriously.
Uh-huh.
I mean, what I can say is that it was a very intense experience. Coming and becoming aware of him, briefly meeting him, being on the stage with him, dealing with the fallout of that, and then the day after feeling, I hesitate to say possessed, but something like the energy was still there. The intensity of that encounter was still with me. It was psychoactive somehow.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say one more thing before you tell us. You wrote a very big, long essay about him. And I wrote about him. I was thinking probably the amount of words we wrote about him is equivalent, except I wrote like a lot of blog posts about him. And I didn't have the discipline perhaps to put that into one essay. It was just how I felt at the time. And so I think we were both possessed by speaking about and thinking about Peterson, and you called that Petersonianitis?
Petersonitis, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, go on.
Right. Well, it was an interesting period. So in some ways, we're speaking now about early 2018 for me. Yeah. So 2 years ago, fully. I just briefly mentioned, of course, that I believe Jordan Peterson. I'm not sure quite what I should call him, but he, he's struggling at the moment, and for what it's worth, I wish him well. And I met his wife on the day, and they're human beings, and whatever else happens, they're going through very difficult times, and I don't wish that on anyone. It was very intense because Peterson was sort of on the front line of the culture war. Yeah. And I was on the stage thinking that I was being something like an honest broker, trying to bring out what I knew was his real quality in certain spheres. There was a certain quality of psychological and theological depth, and an intensity of communication, and a passion that I felt was missing in public life. And I thought, there's a lot going on here. There's a reason people are drawn to this person. He has a certain prophetic quality that we're missing, right? Yeah. And especially my sort of liberal progressive chums who were just finding him, were just allergic. They just couldn't see it at all. They just saw him as the bogeyman.
As the devil or something, yeah.
Right, and I thought that wasn't the whole story. On the other hand, having tried to sort of elicit from him slightly more nuanced positions on, for example, climate change, the way his fans viewed that online was that I was just typecast as any other lefty, And there was even one particular YouTube video that I think said, leftist host
was destroyed by Peterson or something.
Or something like that, or attacks Peterson, instantly regrets it, or and these things were viewed in their millions, like literally millions of times. And I was right at the center of that, and partly because of that, walking around the streets, my hairdresser, my neighbor, my people at my son's school, they said, are you that guy who was speaking with Peterson? That's how big it was at the time. So it was a very intense experience. And I actually took about 2 or 3 months, I forget exactly how long, to write that piece on Medium. That's now on Medium. Yeah. The other thing that went wrong is that I thought, because I'd spent so long in it, I should try and publish it somewhere big and, get more attention for it. Because I felt what was going on was really important, which was not so much what Peterson's saying, because anyone can read the books or watch the videos and make their judgment. Yeah. Not so much really the cultural, we have a word in Scots, stramash, like mess, fangle, confusion, that was a fallout from that, about Peterson, yes or no, right? That also felt a bit lame, really a culture that obliges us to pick a side, like, surely we can learn better than that and find the active ingredients, the insights, without buying into someone wholesale. And yet, polarization is such that was difficult. And so what I was writing about is, what do you do in that context? Yeah. Having having absorbed a lot of his material, having gone through a little bit of the culture war, and not really being on any particular side of that. So in amongst the sort of meta game community, as we sometimes call ourselves, trying to think, well, what can I say about Peterson that's of any value? Yeah. And I tried, as you know. You were right, I think, in some ways, that there was a little part of me that was trying to be smarter than Peterson. You know, there's a little part of me that was trying to beat him at his own game and out-nuance the professor. And maybe there was a little bit of hubris in that.
Yeah.
But it was still,
well, you were probably right in your critique of me as being trying to monopolize the situation to get people to pay attention to my articles. I mean, I just have to write something about Peterson to even today, and you know, I'll get thousands of people that will read it. So sure. So it's temptation, you know.
Well, there's that, but I mean, also, it was connected to lots of other things. Suffice to say that I think that essay might still be one of the best things I've written, because it was so important for me to process what I'd gone through, to be right at the heart of that culture war. It wasn't really about him at all, you know, not really. It was about what he signified about where we are, and our inability to speak coherently in this somewhat contaminated cultural context. And yet to bring to bear the things that were forgotten, like, what is your answer to the climate collapse? Yeah. Where are you on inequality? What is happening to democracy? Where are those questions in this debate? And can you listen to what he's saying without just watching those little fragmented clips that show you in your filter bubble what you want to see? Oh, sure.
Well, the funny thing for me is that I was characterized as a sort of Peterson fanboy that was just supporting him, but I actually had some criticisms in my articles of him, and you were characterized as, you know, attacking Peterson and a progressive, you know, social justice warrior, but you actually had some appreciation for certain aspects of his thinking. So it's funny, like we got pushed on this other side, whereas only now I guess we're having an open conversation about it.
Right, and I mean, you know, it's not about him, it's not about us, it's about, you know, the predicament, which is, how do you speak of contentious matters in a way that goes beyond picking a side? You know, how do you get beyond tribal affiliation as your primary reference point for a public conversation? And that's what Peterson brought into the public square. It was like, okay, here is this very intense, somewhat toxic, for many very inspiring cultural warrior, who also did other things. You know, he signified expertise, but he didn't always speak about his area of expertise. He played off that, and yet he would often be very speculative on political matters, and people would only hear that, but not hear where he really was quite profound. I mean, all of that was going on. So it was a kind of epistemic, what was it? Thunderstorm, really. It was a sort of epistemic thunderstorm in which no one really knew how to orient themselves adequately. Yeah. Some just became fanboys or fangirls, mostly fanboys, of course. Some just thought, this is just a misogynist who's into himself, he's a performer. And those two worlds weren't part of the same world. They were watching their own versions of reality, and then they were attacking each other, and the attack was part of how the reality perpetuated itself. And so I could feel both sides of that because of the networks that I'm in. And, you know, I was conflicted because I didn't think he was A, the good guy, B the bad guy, or C, somewhere in between. I thought something else was going on.
What was going on? Can we look at that now? Like, for me, I think he blew open a huge, you know, possibility. Whereas there are some problematic aspects of his thinking, but at the same time, I see him as blowing up this huge possibility and now disappearing. Like, he's not there anymore. He's gone. He was so present on some level, at least if you were a person who spent any time online, and now he's just gone.
Right.
The whole conversation about him is almost over or something, and it's like he's just dead. Or I mean, I don't want to. I mean,
sure.
It's very odd. It's very
well. You might say it's odd, although for many this was always on the cards. He looked like a shooting star somehow.
Oh, sure.
It's an extraordinary trajectory that couldn't continue itself. But I mean, my answer to what was going on is I forget how long it was. It was roughly about 10,000 words, 2 or 3 months of work, trying to process that. I think it's called Cultural Indigestion, What We Learned and Failed to Learn from Jordan Peterson's Rise to Fame. As you know there, I go through 12 different perspectives on him. Yeah. Some of which were about his thoughts, some of which were about the reaction to him, some of which were about critique, some of which were about kind of appraisal. You know, it's no accident that people like, for example, Ken Wilber highlighted that he was onto something important. But equally, he was partial. You know, he was true but partial. He was tapping into the lost spiritual dimension of our lives. He was critiquing liberalism indirectly by saying, look, he was also critiquing certain aspects of postmodernism, although perhaps caricaturing them too. A lot was going on. He was prismatic, I think. That was one of the words I used to make sense of him. He was also fairly, I called him multiphrenic, because unlike schizophrenia, which is a kind of disorder, he could move between the kind of avuncular, sympathetic guy who guides you through life to the somewhat shrill cultural warrior who attacks someone in the tenor that will get the maximum amount of retweets. So he was just, like I say, a kind of epistemic thunderstorm that we needed to get out of the rain for a while to make sense of it. I don't think he himself or his thought is particularly important, actually. I think when you look very closely at Maps of Meaning and the 12 Rules for Life and his videos, there's a lot of fascinating material there. But the biggest part of the fascination was the spectacle. Yeah. Which is this man on fire with a determination to make sense.
Well, one thing that I noticed is that most people weren't really paying attention to his actual ideas. They were mostly paying attention to the spectacle. That's true.
I mean, I think...
And I don't think his ideas, I think he was doing a good job of bringing Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and all of these thinkers who I loved in my 20s, you know. Yeah. I mean, if he had been around in my 20s, I just would have, you know, I always think that my interest in him was like not me right now, where I'm at right now, but my 20-year-old self who was reading Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn and just really deeply into the existentialism and Carl Jung and all that. And so that's where I come from in terms of. Right. When there's this guy speaking about him with such charisma and eloquence, I ate it up completely. While at the same time, you know, I had, you know, I don't think his critique of postmodernism is very deep, and I think that he does tend to have caricaturized, you know, positions on things, and he attacks social justice warriors when he's being a social justice warrior. You know, I could see all that critique. At the same time, I don't think he was insincere. I think he had his weaknesses, and he was being attacked in such a pathetic, you know, malevolent way by a lot of people at the same time that I felt I had to, you know, defend him against that on some level.
Right, right. I mean, for what it's worth, in the essay, the first symptom of Petersonitis I describe as mesmerized intellectual excitement at the spectacle of passionate thinking, laced with confusion at what exactly is being said. And then I have moral dumbfounding arising from the intuition that Peterson is wrong in important ways, even when his reasoning is persuasive. And then finally, and slightly, you know, playfully, emotional exhaustion caused by too many hours expecting answers from an anguished face on a computer screen. Because of course his rise to fame was principally online, and you know, these videos that were watched by and shared so widely. But suffice to say that I think as a cultural phenomenon, he was very important because he spoke to people in a way others were not speaking to. You know, the comparison I used in the intro actually was Noam Chomsky. And when I said that to some people on the sort of...
Well, he's like Noam Chomsky on some level, you were saying.
Well, in the sense that he inspired sort of thousands of a particular kind of outlook and generation. He was meeting a need in the culture at the time. to make sense of something. Chomsky was more about the military-industrial complex and, abuse.
And it was more about, just getting your shit together on some level.
Yeah, he was about, Chomsky's kind of abuses of power, look more deeply at the system, see how corrupt it is, see how hold power to account in the right way. And that was needed at the time. Peterson's more like, what's happened to the meaning of life? And people are like, yeah, that's the question. Where is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad, to be honest, after writing that piece, I felt it was like an exorcism of sorts. It was like, I haven't thought about him for the last 2 years, hardly at all. But I'm glad I went through it. It was an experience. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was very personal for you. Like, I think that my critique of your article was that you were saying that you were not being personal, where it seemed to me a very personal article on some level.
Right. Probably. I mean,
it seemed to be something very personal in it to you.
It was personal because I was there with him. Where I am in my career as well, like what Perspectiva's up to is partly about trying to bring to bear fundamental questions of meaning and purpose into the public realm in a way that informs debates about things like the economy and society and democracy. And Peterson seemed to be doing that. So on the one hand, he was like an ally. On the other hand, he was doing it in a way that was quite reactionary and quite, get back to basics, stop trying to think you can change the world, just tidy your room. And so I was conflicted between, on the one hand, he was a huge ally, bringing to bear the right kinds of questions. But I was also very ambivalent because he was doing it in such a way that he was antagonizing the kinds of people I felt needed to hear it most.
Interesting.
So that, it was personal in that professional sense. It might have been more than that. It was also that I felt I could see where he was correct and where he wasn't, and I wanted to make sense of that. But to be honest, you're right. I think there was a little bit, with hindsight, of motivated reasoning in terms of trying to sort of be the ultimate insight into Peterson. There's a certain hubris about that. And finally,
I kind of think what Nietzsche says, that everybody's philosophy is very personal on some level. So,
as you say, philosophies are very personal. And I think the thing about Peterson that wasn't said enough is that he has a very bleak, fairly dark outlook on life. And it's informed by the readings of Solzhenitsyn and reflecting on the Soviet Union and the Gulag. And for him, those were like, that's where reality is. That's the battle that must be fought and won at all times. That's
life is suffering, the first noble truth, but not the other ones.
Right, but this is not the Buddha's first noble truth. This was something more like the monster at the gate at all times that has to be, that's waiting to come and eat you. It's less about.
So it's too much of a monomyth or something. That's
well, I feel. I suppose. When I read some on the back of the Peterson experience, I read a bit more Solzhenitsyn, and I got to know Life in the Gulag. And I think for Peterson, Life in the Gulag is a very important reference point. Yeah. It's like things could be so much worse, and he's right, and we don't realize that enough. And with the with virus at the moment, to come back to that, we're sensing that, right?
Well, I think was the important part of his message, in a sense. Is like kind of look at the potential for what you could be, or you could be the camp guard at Auschwitz. And
there's the shadow issue, but it's also he maybe wasn't sufficiently clear at, yes, life is actually pretty peachy compared to how it could be in the Gulag. But there was a sense in which he always felt the Gulag was somehow the human default, that somehow that was our natural inclination to veer that way. If we didn't win the ideological battle in the right way, we would regress to that. And I'm not sure he ever quite won that argument. That was always more his personal stuff than something he actually convinced people of.
Okay. Okay.
Anyway, that's enough. I'm happy to.
Yeah, sure. That's great. I'm glad we had that conversation. I think I've also exercised Peterson out of my system through writing about him a lot, and I don't have much more to say about it. I move on, and I'm exploring other areas. Right.
I'm glad. I'm very glad.
I started to write about John Vervaeke. I started to study that.
Right.
And I didn't really want to be typecasted as being
Sure.
somebody who, because I studied Buddhism for years. I have all these other interests. So
Yeah.
it was a period. It was a very intense period, I think.
And I don't think we need to feel any great regret about being part of it. And it passed a lot of people by. Some people have never heard of him. Some have heard of him who just don't like.
Yeah, some think, who's this guy?
Yeah, my impression also is those who are real scholars in the kind of the main, people like Zach, just wasn't that impressed. He
wasn't that impressed, yeah.
Sort of let it go. And so there are people who didn't get caught up in it. For me, it was a very good growth experience to go through it and process it.
Mm-hmm. Good.